Okay, good afternoon then. Well, we've just seen Donald Trump, after inviting several senior leaders in South Africa, display a rather dramatic picture of what's going on in South Africa. I think part of the problem with trying to discuss this sensibly is that both sides are scared of a certain perception developing. Now, if you are minority over here and you're concerned about minority rights, you're going to be, or if you're white and on the right internationally, you're going to be concerned about what's happening to white people in South Africa. And a lot of people are very concerned that matters are getting worse, that discrimination is intensifying, that violence may be intensifying. On the other side of the picture, you've got people who are obviously scared of sanctions. And I think even people who are very concerned about the condition of white people down here are also scared of sanctions. Sanctions are going to hurt the economy. They're going to hurt a lot of people in South Africa. And so even the representatives of white people in South Africa, namely AfriForum and Solidarity, they have insisted on telling the American government, as they started to turn their eyes towards South Africa, please don't place sanctions on us. This was something that they were very, very, very hard on. They desperately didn't want America to place sanctions on the South African economy. In the meantime, they got blamed for, well, basically they've gotten blamed for the entire situation. And you still see articles today. There was something in News 24, which is for people overseas. That is the dominant news platform in South Africa. It was formerly the national press, which was partially state-owned and is still partially state-owned. The state is the biggest shareholder in this private news company. The mother company being known as Naspers or Nasionale Pers, the national press company, right? So now they've gone after people in South Africa who tweet things they don't like. So there's been this guy who's known as Boer or Twatterbaas on Twitter. And what the editors of News 24 decided to do was publish his name, his face, his home address, where his family live, where his place of work is, stick it all into an article, and then say, oh, they're doing it just so that he can be held to account. Well, we know what that actually means in practice, because if you want to hold someone's views to account, you just point out what's wrong with them. If you say that holding someone to account requires their physical location, that means you want to physically harm them. This is just logically obvious. So that gives you the sort of picture of where the mainstream is at the moment. And remember, the people running News 24, a lot of them, including the editorial staff, are white. But they're white leftists. So it's a very specific frame. Now, part of the reason that you're going to get this weird polarization is that a lot of people are terrified of the idea of South Africa not working out, the Rainbow Nation falling apart. It's a very integral part of their worldview. Most people have internalized the idea that being racist is the worst possible sin you can commit. Whether that's true or not is obviously debatable. But the fear of being seen as racist is not something that is merely a calculated psychological disposition, but is also something which touches subconsciously and frames a lot of the way that people approach topics in South Africa. So what you've had happen since Donald Trump has zeroed in on South Africa is that the entire establishment, and by the establishment, I mean everyone who's part of a certain social crowd where they run in the same circle. So you can talk about News 24, you can talk about the media, News 24, IOL, Daily Maverick, Mail and Guardian, and so as well as the major political parties, with the sole exception of the Vryheidsfront Plus, have all aligned behind the idea that every one of the complaints that has been raised in America is bullshit. Now, that's obviously not true, but I think it's worth addressing what is being exaggerated so that people can have a bit of a more, let's say, reasonable and level-headed approach to these things. So, number one, the obvious question, is there a genocide happening in South Africa? No. I mean, we all know this isn't the case. But once you sort of get the obvious answer out of the way, then the other questions float to the top. So that'll be things like, why are people worried about genocide? Why is this a thing that people are even thinking about? Right? Now, part of the problem comes back to an old Lauren Southern documentary released, I think, in 2015, 2016, somewhere around there. And she went and interviewed a bunch of rural farmers who are having a bit of a hard time, people who are victims of really egregious, torturous violence. We know what the sort of modus operandi are for farm murders. These things are not pretty. I don't like discussing them unnecessarily. You can go and find them out by yourself. But what she did is she put a certain spin on it. She took the most heavy-handed perspective possible. Now, because she was associated with the alt-right, and because the establishment at the time, the left-wing establishment, had full spectrum dominance in the West, what happened is that this was zeroed in on to an extraordinary degree. So anyone who discussed any issue related to the South African race relations issues became immediately tarred with the feather of white supremacists. Tarred with the brush of white supremacy. So she painted a target on her back. And not only that, we started to get organizations like, there's this anonymous organization called Stop White Genocide. You can go look them up. It's I think 3 or 4 white Chinese from Hermanos or wherever they're from. I'm not really sure. They've been very good at hiding their identity. So I can't really speculate about it too much. But there is a little written about this. So for the past decade or so, they've been lurking around online, and you'll bump into them occasionally under various handles. And it takes a few encounters with them to be able to recognize the communication style. There's one in particular who is recognizable. I know it's a woman, but that's about it. I know she's white, but again, that's about it. These activists have gotten a lot of attention they got a lot of attention for a number of years, and they got plugged into the whole sort of disinformation fact-checking environment. So what they managed to dig up on various hi Rob, how you doing? Robert King from the Referendum Party has just dropped in chat. So what I'm saying is there are these sort of low-level activists who do a lot of dirt digging, and then there's a mid-level sort of group of people and they have connections in the United States as well. A lot of the stuff they dug up was used internationally. They've since fallen out of vogue a little bit, but I think they sort of they hit on a certain moment. And they managed to dig up a lot of things that painted a lot of the early activism to try and draw attention to our issues in a very bad light. And some of it not unfairly, because there was a lot of sloppiness in those early days. In the last few years, people have gotten much more slick, much more professional, much more focused on factual issues, because they realized that in the climate that had been generated after the wake of Lauren Southern's documentary, it was a very delicate topic that was very difficult to get anyone's attention on. Now, I personally, when I was doing my master's degree, there was an event for sort of job seeker type people that was hosted by the Danish ambassador, and I went over to him after the talk. You know, when they were pouring the little like the single free glass of champagne that everyone gets. And I said to him, "Listen, you know, I come from South Africa. I'm worried about things happening. We have this kind of hostile situation. I'm worried about the state of the economy, because if it collapses, nasty things will happen. There's, expropriation, all of this kind of stuff, right?" And he said, well, this is very serious, but I'm afraid this is not something that we ought to broach. Within 6 months of that, I obviously didn't keep contact with him, but I did find it amusing that 6 months later, I think it was Zimbabwe, who was, being ambassador to Denmark, and she said something like really aggressively, like openly pro-genocide in public, and that got some attention. So I do wonder, whether, because I'm not the only one having these discussions with people. I do wonder whether over time the attention has sort of trickled up to soaked up to the top. But you need to. It took Donald Trump really to remove the last stoppage that allowed people to talk about it. But the problem is that Donald Trump is so bombastic and so unconcerned with sort of rigorous accuracy. He only wants the broad strokes. He only wants to focus on the issues he cares about, which is understandable. He's a politician. He wants to get things done. But the problem is that it deranges everybody else. And I don't just mean his enemies. People talk about Trump derangement syndrome. But I think this affects his supporters as well. A lot of people who see benefit in Donald Trump will cheerlead everything that he does instead of quietly sitting back and going, well, actually, is this really the case? Now, the problem with the exaggerations is it makes it impossible to really discuss what the problems are. And I think the question at the heart of this whole issue is not, is there genocide happening or not? Because obviously one has not been committed, right? We're still around. There's still a few million of us. Farm murders are nasty, but they're a small portion of national homicide. There's enormous discrimination, but we managed to get by and do actually better than average in this country as an ethnic group. So we need to articulate our position and our concerns in very crystal clear language, so that it doesn't become insane and disregarded. Part of the reason I think this is important is not just because obviously being accurate and telling the truth is something that's universally important. It's also because from a practical perspective, Donald Trump is not going to be around forever. And while a lot of elements of the post-war ideological and institutional framework have started to collapse and decay, the left has not died. They are not going to die. Those people are not going away. They are going to come back, right? And when they come back, you cannot be so fragile in your position that you cannot articulate what you need to say about the world. And granted, we are not America. But the difference between America and South Africa is, well, the distance, shall I say, between America and South Africa is a lot less than it was before the internet came about. We live in the same informational ecosystem. English-speaking South Africans pay an enormous amount of attention to international politics and are the decisive factor in shaping the narratives that we consume in the media in South Africa. People somehow have not realized this. And English-speaking South Africans, Anglos, for sake of convenience, Anglos really are a lot more liberal and a lot more likely to be left-wing than Afrikaners. This is just true. And so we are a decisive part of the whole sort of ecosystem. So those of us who are sort of more conservative and on the right need to be quite on our toes in the next couple of years. And we need to be able to articulate ourselves clearly and reasonably. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just share one thing quickly. I'm just going to share my screen. If you'd bear with me for one little moment. I hope this is the right one. Right. So what we have here is a study that was conducted. It's an epidemiological study, which I invite you all to look up. It's only done on men, right? But this is a very important study. It's possibly the only source of serious information to understand the differences in homicide in South Africa between the races. And It doesn't particularly serve anyone's narrative here very well, although it does over here very well. But it serves the international liberal establishment's narratives very well if you don't know how to handle this information and interpret it. So this study was an epidemiological study conducted on several dozen police stations around the country, sampling thousands of murders. I think it clocks up to 200,000 homicides. And what they did is they sort of analyzed it by, well, is the race of the perpetrator known? What is the race of the victim? So on and so forth. And again, only men, because 85% of homicide victims are men. What they did find is very revealing, because what it turns out is that the homicide rate is almost all taken up by black violence, colored violence, and Indian violence, or rather, shall I say, non-white victims. Now, our homicide rate is over 45 per 100,000. It's really, really insane. It's one of the highest homicide rates on the planet. White people die from homicide, or at least white men, to be perfectly specific, at a rate of 3 per 100,000. That's equivalent with the Baltic states, European countries. This is something that people on the right don't appreciate. We want to feel like we are being, that we want to appeal for victim status. I don't like that. I think victim status is a terrible thing to pursue. I think it corrodes your agency. I think it corrodes your mentality in so many different ways. But what that 3 per 100,000 figure really means is that white people have established, a niche in society where we are capable of protecting ourselves. We know that the white homicide victimization rate was higher in the 90s and was declining when they stopped reporting it in 2003. Now, I should say why they stopped reporting it. Now, in 1998, 99, I can't remember the year precisely, but it was around then, a report was commissioned under Nelson Mandela's presidency. Who initiated it in particular, I don't know, but it was finalized in 2003. And this report was into farm murders, and it found that 66% of homicide victims in rural areas were white, but they were only 5% of the rural population. Now, this was very worrying, but what happened is, what the response was very interesting, because the very next year, the government halved the number of police stations in rural areas. They stopped reporting the race of crime victims and perpetrators of crime, and they swept the whole thing under the carpet. Now, another thing that's worth looking up, and again, I want you to go and look up this study if you have even 5 seconds of your time and pore through it, because one of the other things that is worth mentioning here is that every other racial group is most likely to be murdered by either family, friends, or acquaintances. However, white people are overwhelmingly most likely to be murdered by strangers. So now, what does that tell you? That tells you that your neighbors, your work colleagues, your family are not going to be dangerous to you. We have, in a strange sort of way, a kind of high-trust society that exists in our little racial bubble. We live in de facto segregated areas. We live together by choice. People don't like to talk about this except on the left. On the left, they notice that white people live together in different areas. If you look at, for example, Adrian Fritz's dot map, and you can go and look this up, it's an enormously entertaining thing to go, not entertaining in a sort of fireworksy way, but sort of very absorbing. It's an interactive dot map. The man, Adrian Frith, he's a data researcher. He's worked for the DA and for a whole bunch of different people, but he put together a dot map of the 2011 census, and you can zoom in anywhere, and you can watch how not only race but language groups cluster in neighborhoods, towns, rural areas, and so on. So that, what we know from personal experience, that, there's white places and black places and colored places and Indian places. it holds up very, very, very sharply on a map, right? And this is not just about apartheid, although apartheid is a huge part of it. 100 years of territorial segregation is going to do this to you. However, a lot of this is by choice. A lot of those lines have moved. We've all known neighborhoods that have shifted white or shifted black based on, although mostly the latter, based on land invasions, property prices shifting, crime, development, what have you. So what this means is that white people will tend to cluster in neighborhoods where they can provide their own neighborhood security, where they can use private security if need be, and they can look after each other more or less. But in other areas, the homicide rate is taken up almost in an enormous degree by either organized crime or by sort of normal, sort of deranged nihilistic violence. One of the things affecting the colored community in particular is what I call the Zimbabwe gang deal. Now, this was from 2011. It was uncovered by Sam Soul in 2015. He's one of the serious veteran investigative journalists in this country who's well worth paying attention to. Yes, a bit of a softy, pinko liberal type character, but very, very good investigative journalist. One thing that happens with his discovery of this deal that Jacob Zuma and Bheki Cele struck with the Cape gangs, and this is currently being wound up at the moment under Ramaphosa, as they're finally going after the head of police intelligence for the Western Cape. I can't remember his first name, but Brigadier or something, Tio, Tio. So he's been wound up, although instead of going after the organized aspect of this pact, they are getting him for an abuse of authority for pursuing a petty theft of a laptop out of his car in Paarl through non-legal channels. So they're going after him for that, and there's also involvement with gang assassinations. It's a long story, but this pact with the gangs caused what was the most rapidly declining homicide rate in the country to become the most rapidly increasing homicide rate in the country, the Western Cape. If you look at a graph of the Western Cape's homicide, actually there is only one, and it's mine, so I should probably find it and share it. Oh, balls. That thing isn't online. I should tell everyone that who's been paying attention to me and my project, The Cape Independent, for a while, that it is still down. I cannot tell you how disappointed I am, although it is only I who am to blame, because I did not learn the technicals. I did not learn programming. I did not learn the technical skills for web design. And I don't have a big enough income to pay for a nice web hosting service. So on the regular, so I raised money to get someone to fix it, and it's taken them 3 months since we hired them, and we're still trying to kick their bum to sort things out. So we have been down for a month now today. I don't know what to say. But it will. I am still persevering. We will come back online. We will start covering the news again. I have to apologize. But on that website, we had if you go on the Wayback Machine, you might be able to find it. There was an article we did on the I did on the Cape gangs, and you can watch the homicide rate. Let me try and start on this side of the screen because it's mirrored. So you watch the Western Cape homicide rate goes down. 2011, it just goes back up again like this. And it meets up with the Eastern Cape homicide level, which is the highest in the country. So what we're dealing with here is a situation where both whites and coloreds are part of a focused intention by the government to overlook crimes that are committed against them. But I think that this is. The volume of the people who die in coloured areas in the Cape due to gang violence is absolutely phenomenal. If you pick certain police precincts, you can find homicide levels that are as high as the front lines of World War II. I mean, just really just stratospheric numbers. It's obscene. Now, one of the things that we notice about farm murders is that the number of attacks peaks around 2018, 2019. The homicides peak slightly earlier, right, around 2016. Now, the current head of the Security Portfolio Committee in Parliament is a member of the DA known as Ian Cameron. Ian Cameron, he has his own organization called Action Society. They focus on crime and, helping victims of crime and pressuring the government, the police to focus on high-profile crimes or procedural issues or abuses of power. It's a very good organization, small but effective for its size, and for the most part, very level-headed. Ian Cameron himself was involved in setting up the national neighborhood security system that AfriForum currently uses. And that system is what is almost entirely responsible for the end of that long-term increase in farm murders. Those numbers are not looking very sexy, to be honest, whether you're looking for it from a propaganda view or whether you're looking at it from a sort of desperate hope that it would end, because they've sort of plateaued around 50 to 60 murders a year, from their height at like 70 to 80. The farming community, obviously, they have a homicide rate that's higher than the general population because there are very few of them, and those number of people dying that's meaningful. But I want to draw your attention back to the statistic that I mentioned from the National Homicide Victimization Study. The reason that those figures are different is because it's very hard to do security in rural areas. It is. It's much easier to do it in an area where you've got lots of neighbors, lots of witnesses, lots of people who can invest in private security, lots of people who can participate in neighborhood watches. And neighborhood watch participation is higher in areas where crime is more of a problem. So in the big cities, right? So out in the small towns in the Western Cape, there's somewhat less of it because, colored crime, for example, tends to be outside of gang crimes, tends to actually be fairly small and petty. They don't involve themselves in hijacking syndicates very much. They don't involve themselves in armed break-in gangs quite as much. So your worries about crime in an urban area is not going to involve the kind of quasi-militaristic behavior that you see from the black population. And part of the reason for this, I believe, and I think a lot of people know, is that much of the armed wing of the ANC from back in the days went into organized crime after the end of apartheid. This has impacted a lot of things. The way that the ANC did things back in the 1980s has left lots of echoes. We know that when there are big riots against immigrants or against a community criminal, we know that there are stonings. We know that there are necklacings. Necklacing was introduced by Mkhonto Sizwe back in the 1980s. In 1987, if you look at Charles Mqakula's book, he explains. Now, there are two books written on this military campaign. One is by Anthea Jeffrey of the Institute of Race Relations, which is an absolutely excellent book, just called The People's War. Actually, both of them are just called The People's War. The other one is by Charles Mqakula, who used to be Minister of Police. The portfolio names keep changing, but he was there during Thabo Mbeki's first term. He infamously said in 2006 or 2004 that if you don't like the high rate of homicide here, you can just leave the country. This kind of like blasé attitude. But paradoxically, despite what he was saying there, he seems to me to be one of the few people in the ANC who had a whisper of a conscience. Him and his wife took the very risky position of standing up and criticizing the necklacing policy back in the old days. And it was discontinued in 1987 because the party realized that, well, it actually wasn't popular. It wasn't popular. It was actually costing them support in the townships. Now, you've got to remember the way that the military conflict that they engaged in through the 1980s had a few little prongs to it. The big one being Operation Vula, but starts earlier. It starts in 79. They go to Vietnam. They get educated in sort of war tactics of a different sort to what they were used to. The early wave of ANC violence under Nelson Mandela was focused on military campaigns, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, right? So these are very sort of classic sort of decolonization war tactics. But the South African state was just way too powerful and competent for them to do anything to. They were all swept up in the Rivonia trials, and they got decapitated most of the leadership of the party, put them in prison. There was the abortive Wankie campaign in 1967, in which Chris Hani nearly lost his life because he criticized the ANC for being corrupt and sitting on their bums while the soldiers were going off to fight in the front lines. And then there was the 1971 Operation J, which didn't even show up, but is worth looking into because that was an actual attempt to instigate genocide. So it was cartoonishly executed. What had happened is that the Soviets, who directly controlled the ANC through the Comintern, all of the leaders of the ANC were members of the Comintern, they took direct instruction. They did not die. They were an armed wing of Soviet power at the time. And what they planned on doing was trying to instigate in South Africa what had happened in Zanzibar. Now, Zanzibar had a revolution in which the black population overthrew the Arab overlords that had ruled the state for hundreds of years. They massacred them, absolutely massacred them. But the whole thing got kicked off by a few sporadic outbursts of violence and just caught fire like a tree full of cotton wool. The difference between that and South Africa is a structured society. Very, very structured, also geographically spread out, very competent modern state. These things were not taken into account somehow. So what happened is that Oliver Tambo and a couple of others came down, and the idea was that they would organize a ship and it would depart from, I think it was Somalia where they were going to depart from, and they were going to land in the Eastern Cape, and they were going to just start killing white people, go crazy. And then everyone would join their side, and they would prepare the ground by having all of these posters distributed saying kill whitey, basically. And I mean, the posters went out, the propaganda went out, but the troops never arrived. And the troops were never very many to begin with. There were only, I think, 24. Vladimir Shubin, who has written on this a lot, he remembers Oliver Tambo weeping that he would not be allowed to go along on this sacred journey, But I mean, they suffered very, very stupid engine troubles due to lack of maintenance. And so you got seawater in the engine and sand and all kinds of crap entering working parts of the ship. Lord knows how. So yeah, they eventually had to abandon the ship and the whole thing before it even reached South Africa. So that never happened. But the intent there was interesting. Another interesting factor for me in considering this whole sort of genocide-y type question is that I think what is happening now is kind of a mirror image of what the Soviet Union did back in the 70s when they got apartheid recognized as a crime against humanity. Now, the term crime against humanity is kind of a thought-terminating cliche. I mean, we hear these words and we kind of say, well, you get a lot of people who are cornered by this question. Do you think apartheid was a crime against humanity or not? And I say, well, that question doesn't make any sense. There's a bit of French revolutionary ideology. It's like, a crime against humanity. What is humanity? It's like, it's weird. Isn't every crime against a person a crime against humanity? So what makes it something special that carries this sort of like weird, sacred, quasi-religious significance? I don't know. I know that the first crime that was considered this was the Holocaust. And applying that comparison to South Africa seems a bit excessive. South Africa was a police state. It was a very authoritarian society. There's lots of censorship. It was racially segregated. It was a racial hierarchy. So there are ugly aspects to this that took a lot of ugly things to maintain. And there was a lot of police violence. But in the whole period that the National Party were in power, only 89 people died in police custody. Only about 1,500 died in protests that were recorded. Perhaps more died that were not recorded. I fully believe that. And during the People's War, a lot of dirty tricks and dirty shenanigans went down, where the police state would intervene to try and push back ANC forces who were committing levels of violence that are absolutely eye-watering. I mean, we think that we have got a peaceful settlement. The reality is we fought a civil war in South Africa for 13, 14 years, and 20,000 people are known to have died as a direct result of these confrontations. But if you go to Wikipedia and look at crime in South Africa, you get that famous graph, which just keeps climbing up gradually through the 20th century until it hits 1979 and goes absolutely geometric. And then it peaks in 1993 and starts declining. And that huge slope upwards, that's the People's War. The area under the graph is a lot larger than 20,000. And in the process, they mostly targeted rival black liberation groups, so IFP, Black Consciousness Movement, so Zulu nationalists and, shall we say, non-communist black nationalists. Those were their enemies, and they ruthlessly eliminated them. Their contacts in the UN High Commission of Refugees assisted them in extraditing those who sought refuge from South Africa into their camps in Tanzania. So they, with the help of the Russian and communist-aligned elements of the United Nations, they renditioned their political enemies and tortured them in camps. This is known. This is not secret history. This has been well documented and written about. But now we get back to, what does this mean for white people? Why is this pertinent to the whole question of... Oh, wait, one note before I do this. That crime against humanity thing, Soviet Union instigates this, and, Holocaust is the reference. And this is I'm ripping this little bit of detail from James Mayberg's excellent articles on this from his series Singapore Revisited. So find it if you can. But no, it's called Death Warrant for the Afrikaner. I think that's the article's name. And what he talks about is the fact that the Soviet Union instigated this charge in the UN to get apartheid ruled a crime against humanity. Okay. Meanwhile, one has to remember, and you can consult an academic by the name of J. Otto Pohl, P-O-H-L, who is a scholar of the Soviet Union, and they ran a much, much more extreme form of ethnic segregation than South Africa did. Way more extreme. Ethnic groups who were deemed counter-revolutionary, like the Germans, the Koreans, and the Cossacks, were removed en masse. Not just them, but other people like the Tatars and so on. But those three specifically were herded into sort of concentrated villages where they would be used for harsh manual labor, worked to death in their hundreds of thousands, barred from attaining employment in various sectors due to their ethnicity, forced to carry passes so that they weren't allowed in certain areas at certain times. All of the same measures that you see in South Africa, the Soviet Union perpetrated themselves in order to suppress troublesome ethnicities. And Otto Pohl, is a member of one of those ethnicities. He's a descendant of what they call the Volga Germans. So he clearly has the right beef. Very meticulous, good study on that. Unfortunately, not a lot of attention paid to his work. He wrote a book on this called The Years of Great Silence. The question over here is now, why is all of this weird stuff about the People's War and all of these funny attempts to instigate warfare in South Africa? Why is that pertinent now? Now, I mentioned earlier that we have a problem with a hangover of Okay, you've organized crime, organized violence. Like a lot of the funding for the ANC, which didn't come from the Soviet Union, came from organized crime, drug distribution. So, like, you have a lot of people like Toke Sexwale was involved in a lot of this back in the day, right? And we've got a number of films that have been made about this in South Africa, fictional films, because, it makes for good entertainment. You have a lot of, gangster shootouts and, cash hijackings and things like this. I mean, that famous film, Jerusalema, it's not a bad crime film, guy gets mentored in the trade of hijacking and doing funny things by old MK cadres, and then works his way up through hijacking buildings and extortion into becoming some kind of kingpin. And then he raises his identity and starts again in Durban at the end of the film. So kind of fun. I think one of the things over here to remember is that, and I'll share this now. Why is this so bloody... Stop screen, thank you. Share screen. Sorry, I have to share something from a... Which window is this? There we go. Thank you. All right. Now let me see if I can find this. I've lost my place in the document, I'm afraid. So here we go. Conditions of conflict. So one of this is from a report that I did for Solidarity just before Adam Surratt's left, and there's this little section that I thought was worth mentioning. I'm just going to read this to you. So I briefly mentioned the People's War, and then I briefly mentioned who their enemies are and what they do with their, and so on and so forth. But here's an interesting one. From 1981, the ANC's policy included targeting white farming families, initially with the intention of undermining rural security, but soon this expanded into the intention of killing enough of them to ethnically cleanse the entire countryside. This was formalized and reiterated in the 1985 Kabwe Conference, which instructed agents to liquidate the white rural population. The ANC Commission on Strategy and Tactics outlined it as follows. In the rural areas, it is necessary to create underground and mass political bases as a foundation for the armed struggle. In areas where suitable conditions exist, units must be sent to be based on the terrain to make contact with and train the local population for action against the enemy. We must undertake a sustained drive to clear the white farms and harass the enemy with mine warfare. Sustained armed activity in the rural areas is important both as a politicizing factor locally and nationally and as a tactic to disperse the enemy. The ANC were later to lie to the Truth and Reconciliation Council, disavowing that they ever authorized attacks on civilians. Several attempts were made to interfere with the investigation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to prevent the ANC being found guilty of gross human rights violations, and Thabo Mbeki even attempted legal action to prevent its publication. So, over there, you look at you can look at the citations here. If you guys want to go and Google some of these things, the ones that you want to look at for this would be citations 136, 137, and 138. That's these guys. If you want to check that out, go take a screen grab, go find that. Okay. So this is very this is very obvious. It was known that this was a whole problem. In fact, so the Kill the Boer thing, I made a little mistake a while ago on Twitter where I attributed it to this period. I mean, the CIA actually knew from 1985. There's a report of theirs that's in the public domain. They knew that this kind of policy was part of the ANC strategy. They knew that eliminating the white population was their final intention. Right? So they intervened to try and ameliorate the problem. I think they got the message in the 1990s that they wouldn't be able to maintain the economy or deliver if they did anything too wild and hairy, and so they postponed things. I mean, there's that famous quote by now I wonder if I did include this over here, so I'm going to actually find frog. There we go. So the famous quote about boiling the frog alive. this is from, let me see if I can find, where is it from? Oh yeah, it's from a man called Dr. Mario Oriani Ambrosini. He worked as the Inkatha Freedom Party's legal counsel, and he wrote his memoirs in 2014, the year before he died of cancer. And there's that the famous quote being he was talking to Ramaphosa in the early 90s. In his brutal honesty, Ramaphosa told me of the ANC's 25-year strategy to deal with the whites. It would be like boiling a frog alive, which is done by raising the temperature very slowly. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So he meant that black majority would pass laws transferring wealth, land, and economic power from white to black slowly and incrementally until the whites lost all they had gained in South Africa, but without taking too much at any given time to cause them to rebel or fight. Now, what's interesting about this is that the 25-year period it marks 2019, the year that Cyril Ramaphosa became president. What I find interesting about this is that the moment he comes to power, he says, I'm going to do phase 2 of the National Democratic Revolution. The National Democratic Revolution is their ideology. It was developed, the main ideological program of the ANC. It was developed by the South African Communist Party in 1928. The reason they came up with this is that after the Rand Rebellion resulted in white workers moving from the supporting communists to supporting nationalists, right? The Communist Party decided, okay, well, this is all done for. This is like what's happening in Europe. We're going to have to move to a different strategy. We're going to go to a native policy. So they moved from being South African Communist Party for white South Africa to being natives of South Africa unite against the whites, right? And so this idea builds on Lenin's two-stage theory of revolution. The first stage is political victory, and the second stage is economic victory. Now, Lenin also staged an economic retreat. One must recall that when he was in charge of the Soviet Union, only 20% of the economy was state-owned. I mean, we think of this as like, oh, overnight they turned into this purely state-owned machine. No, that's not true. And under the new economic plan, they actually liberalized a little bit until Stalin came to power and did real communism, you know? So these kind of tactical retreats are not new, and they're baked into the program. So the first stage, gain political power. Second phase, build socialism. So the ANC is gaining power by gaining simple political power, but has not control over the economy in the early 90s. They have to develop this slowly. So black economic empowerment starts with voluntary deals and all kinds of things that cut members of the old elite into the political process. One can watch the evolution of certain companies like Sintel, who runs most of the country's traffic services, both the front and back end of like fines and so on, as well as all of your traffic lights and your surveillance systems and so on. Right? They also direct traffic and so on in most major cities. They've had static contracts in almost every major urban area since 2006, the last year that the ANC were in charge of all of the major cities. They cut a deal with this company to basically give them access to everything. And they've more or less monopolized this for a long time. They sell most of your data off to the Canadians and Belgians and whoever wants to research sort of traffic patterns or what have you. But they used to be known as Plessy, a very, very large and serious arms manufacturer. I can't remember what they were called briefly in the 90s, but they've been involved in several corruption scandals. They were dug into by the Sariti Commission. They were dug into by the Zondo Commission. But they're not special. They're part of a sort of long tradition. What happens is that you've got these sedimentary layers of elite. So the primary elite in South Africa is the Rothschild family. The Rothschild family financed the Round Table Group that instigated the war effort against the Boer republics, right? It was war of acquisition. It wasn't, it wasn't really very much justified. But after they put the country under British rule, They, together with JP Morgan, financed the takeover of much of the mines with the Oppenheimer family. The Oppenheimer family were given funding to take this over. Very astute and savvy businessmen. They managed to corner a lot of interesting markets. They managed to get monopoly diamond access. The De Beers empire that we all know is a result of this handshake deal. A series of deals, actually. Didn't all happen in one fell swoop. It was about 20 years of actual, a fair amount of graft. But during this time, the Oppenheimer family were represented in Parliament. So they hold seats in the South African Party. When the South African Party was shunted aside, and you got Afrikaners who built up wealth through mutual aid societies, and a small number of diamond mines that were established with a couple of loans to small operators on the West Coast. You started to get a bit of an entry into the elite by the Afrikaners. And then the Rupert family was allowed in to the elite and cut in on various sort of large-scale deals that allowed them to enter high society. After Anton Rupert developed his tobacco empire. But it's a very, very small room up there at the top of society. We are one of the most extremely oligarchic societies on the planet. And once they'd allowed a few Afrikaners in, by the time that they were included in the elite, it was time to wind up the show, because in 1976, we had Henry Kissinger come to South Africa and tell Forster to wrap it up. He'd just been doing a tour all over the continent promoting decolonization. Remember, decolonization was since the very day that the Second World War ended, the primary aim of the United States overseas. They had spent much of the interwar period using state-backed investment to take control of European companies across Africa and the rest of the world. And when the Second World War was over, they wished to see all of the European control of the various states collapse so that their commercial interests could be supreme wherever they were. And this was very effective. They essentially bought up and then liquidated the entire British Empire. There were two holdouts to this, South Africa and Rhodesia. So Rhodesia gets liquidated because, well, the Soviets are tired of having any kind of Western involvement. The Chinese take the lead with the ZANU-PF, and they get a foothold in Southern Africa. And South Africa has to go because the market needs to be bashed open. During sanctions, what happened was that a lot of major companies were forced to leave. And the Oppenheimers were instrumental in leaking information about various companies assisting the pro-democracy forces in not strictly legal ways in South Africa. It doesn't mean that they were doing anything particularly nasty, but we had very strict sort of media laws. We had a lot of censorship. So there were some brief scandals in the 1960s, and then a couple of banks were forced to leave. What happened is that Harry Oppenheimer, he buys up everyone who leaves. And by the end of the 1980s, and you should read this book, they control 80% of the formal economy, either directly or indirectly. Okay. Now, what happened is that they've developed after apartheid fell, they developed something called the Brenthurst Institute. It's a big think tank. They do some fairly decent work, good polling, good analysis of infrastructure, although sometimes a bit self-serving. And they do a number of little interventions here and there. They drafted the program for legislating black economic empowerment. In the 90s, it was mostly voluntary and informal and corrupt. But what they wanted to do was systematize it and make it predictable. That way, they have a new method of bringing in a slice of the new elite into this oligarchical power structure in South Africa. And they bring in Patrice Motsepe, and they bring in Cyril Ramaphosa, and they bring in all of these bigwigs, most of them ANC members, which is very, very good for them because it gives them direct access to political power, right? Sorry, indirect access to political power. Let's be strict about it. And it gives the ANC an opportunity to take a slice of the economy. Now, this was a long diversion, but I have a point here, which is that the National Democratic Revolution, as we mentioned earlier, has a second phase. But the ANC have their eye at all times on balance of forces. Now, in 2011, now you're going to have to look for various elements of this all over the shop. The Helen Suzman Foundation reported some of this, but you can find it elsewhere. And the JSE reports this only infrequently, so it's difficult to find. But the balance of forces in the economy tipped 50-50 between whites and black in around 2012, 2013-ish, around then. So this comes out from census data. This comes out from JSE reports. So around this time, the 2013 Johannesburg Stock Exchange report showed that of domestically owned shares, 22% were owned by whites and 23% were owned by blacks. The rest is foreign owned, like major corporations, pension funds, all kinds of stuff, right? So you've got this balance is finally achieved where the whole of black society and the whole of white society are now evenly balanced in the economy. The same goes for home ownership in terms of economic value, not in terms of land area. This remains unequal. But in terms of economic value, it tips over. In the private sector, if you include the government, then it actually tips over to being very much in the favor of black society. And so by 2019, Jacob Zuma comes to power. Sorry, not Jacob Zuma. Jacob Zuma is taken out of power. Cyril Ramaphosa is in power. When he starts his first elected term, what he does is announce that he is going to finally institute full-on black nationalist socialism. And so now we're seeing race quotas ratcheted up to the point where, anyone entering the labor market now, if you're white and you're young, you will not get a bloody job unless you're willing to move to the other side of the country. Because, well, you might get a job. Someone is getting a job because that's the way quotas work. Someone will be getting to sit on that quota. But when 4% of professional positions are apportioned to you and you compose half of all qualified graduates, this doesn't look good. You are now competing with every other white person for a slice of the pie that is 1/10th of your number, right? So it's looking pretty egregious. They haven't passed this yet, but it's coming down the pipeline. There's lots of people trying to challenge it from various angles, strategically, legally, administratively. But, this is coming. Every year they keep ratcheting it up. And every year they're adding new layers of very, very sort of silly state centralist programs. They've got one called the district development model. The district development model sits and which it's only been implemented in a few areas, but the idea is to gradually destroy the autonomy of local municipalities because the 96 Constitution actually hands a lot of autonomy to the municipalities. And it's a place where small clusters of minorities can still assert some form of representation in politics. They can't at the national level. It's meaningless. The DA, as you see in government, they've achieved nothing. Nothing at all. They have no will nor power to achieve any concessions from the ANC. Okay? And I'm not going to go into details here, but everyone knows this. Like, they can trumpet their sort of marginal, sort of fiddly little victories as much as they like. They have done nothing. They haven't even tried. There are many things they could try, and I can list them in a different video, but they're not trying. They don't care. They actually enjoy sitting and picking their belly buttons up there in Pretoria and in Parliament in Cape Town. So So the second phase is going to come to pass. The point is to balance the economy so that you make it racially representative. But in doing so, you push white people out of the economy. The only thing that we can do is leave the country in order to sustain ourselves, right? Because these quotas are not mandated. If you've got a 100% black company, no one can sue you for discriminating against white people, right? It's a minimum. So the idea is that you ratchet up that quota until there are no white people left. Now, this is what Indonesia did with the Dutch. And eventually they were left stranded and had to be picked up by their government. But we don't have a home to go to. The United States wants to, if the United States wants to be the home that we go to, I guarantee there's going to be, I resent that idea, shall we say. I like the idea of partitioning the country so that every group is at least allowed to have a voice somewhere, to be big enough not to be pushed around, to have a say, right? This is important. I think we will do perfectly fine even if we are a minority, but if we're too small a minority, we do get to a point that we cannot survive. And so when people ask, are we experiencing a genocide? The question is not actually all that relevant, because it's obvious we're not. The question is, are we in existential peril? And I think I think that we actually are. The trouble is knowing exactly when is almost impossible. But there is a very, very clear guide, and that is the state of the national fiscus. Now, we know that 50% of the population are dependent on the state for their survival, right? They take grants of various kinds, or they're employed by the state or whatever, you know. Most of the state is bloat. They're one of the biggest employers in the country. They constitute a third of the national economy, at least. And this means that the state is the state and the population are very, very dependent, like deeply, deeply, deeply dependent on the small tax base. And they've kind of squeezed us as much as they can. Now, the first time I noticed that we were struggling to control our expenditure was when I looked at, it wasn't to do with South Africa, the thing that triggered this for me. It was a few years ago. I saw a chart of the OECD countries for the 20th century, right? And you watch state expenditure as a percentage of GDP rising and rising and rising to the point where now it's around half the economy is state expenditure. And so most of the economy in the West is fake. No wonder it's stagnant. No wonder it's hard to get anything done. It's just stodge. Everything's calcified. But what this does is you get to a certain point where you can't actually spend anymore and you can't tax anymore. So then either you default and strip down the government. Either you default and you strip down the government, or you print a load of money. Now, Zimbabwe kind of did a bit of all three, because they spent beyond their means, then they borrowed from the IMF, then they realized that structural adjustment meant that they could not maintain political stability because there weren't funds to support the mid-level elites that were necessary to support the government, right? So they had to print money to pay these people and to service their debt. And printing is kind of a soft default. This is true. Sorry, comment a lot of people in the comment section here. But then once they printed so much money, they couldn't go anywhere, and they had to give land to compensate their generals and so on, because, well, what else are you going to give them now that your money is worthless? What's interesting is that Robert Mugabe didn't do this to begin with. He didn't start off in charge and say, okay, look, Lancaster House Agreement's a load of horse shit. I'm going to liquidate the white people's land. No. They had this situation where, well, Britain pays for half, Zimbabwean state pays for half, and we gradually buy out all of the farmers so black people can have a piece of land. Right? That's kind of what we've had in South Africa until now. We've had something much like the Lancaster House Agreement, where it's a willing buyer, willing seller system, right? And most people, over 95%, take cash instead of land. The ANC is keeping on returning back to the question of land instead of well-being and actual tangible justice. Because for them, the only question at the end of the day is, are there still white people in this country? Do they need to be considered as human in any way whatsoever? As long as those questions are yes, their revolution is not over. And it sounds extravagant to frame it that way, but I'm going to teach you something about Bantu linguistics now. Now, the Southern Bantu languages, now, if you've tried to learn a few of them, you'll pick up there are a couple of quirks. Now, I learned this when I was, a few years ago, I was living in Northwest Province. I was working as a manual farm laborer when I was like 19, 20, right? And I had to learn enough Setswana to get by. I didn't stay long enough to get, fluent or anything, but I could kind of manage to do basic stuff and ask for directions, buy stuff from the shop, share information on with my colleagues and so on what we're doing. But you'll get like a funny thing happening where they'll refer to people who are not. You learn all of the rules of the grammar and sort of like, okay, well, if you refer to human beings like over there, like they, then you refer to them as, bana, or, batsamaya, they are walking. There's like a particle that you put in front of the word, all of the words in the sentence that marks them as this pertains to they. Human beings. And then there's those objects. And then you put le in front or di in front, right? Depending. It's complicated. Sorry, not Zulu, Tswana, Setswana, Batswana people. Now, one day I asked someone what happened with there was a fight in a tavern. I asked him, what happened or whatever, and the guy responded with a very strange sentence. He said, "Bana batso balaya, bana bararo le Zulu." I thought, what the hell? What do you mean Le Zulu? You mean like Zulu people? Why Le? And I thought about this for a long time, but neither he nor I spoke enough of each other's languages to actually have a serious sort of question and answer session about this grammatical feature. It took some time to figure it out, and it turns out that anyone who is not a member of your group is not referred to by any of the grammatical features that mark you as a human being. You are referred to with the same noun class that is used for animals and inanimate objects. So white people are not ba koa, we are le koa. And this happens as well in Xhosa Zulu. We are never, ever, under any circumstances, referred to as mtu, a person, a human being. We are always referred to as abelungu. We are a separate social category. There is not one single person that I've ever encountered who has ever thought that anything like this is a problem on any level. Dehumanization is an intrinsic feature of African culture. When we talk about Ubuntu, we are talking about the direct translation of the word, which of course doesn't carry all of the semantic nuances, but the most literal and direct translation you can use is humanness. Now, the connotations of Ubuntu is this is how you treat fellow human beings. But you will often hear it said, well, this person, he doesn't have Ubuntu, or white people, they don't have Ubuntu. This is what they mean. You are not, strictly speaking, at a social level, at a moral level, a human being. You are outside, right? You are something else. Now, there is one place academically where you can actually find someone brave enough to discuss this. And no, they're not a white person. They're a supporter of this who thinks that this is absolutely excellent and a perfect expression of African culture. And that would be Ndumiso Tladla, who's the head of philosophy. He does philosophy of law at University of Pretoria. And he wrote Tladla's DLA, right? And he wrote his thesis. It's called like the philopraxis of something. If you look, philopraxis is a fairly wanky word, so there's not many people who use it. So if you look up Tladla and philopraxis, you'll find the PhD, and in it he describes how how categorically we are not human. White people, we're not really peoples. It's very, very clear, right? And he'll introduce little contingencies to make sure. No, of course, this is not absolute. In theory, you could, right? And it's not biological. Of course, it's not biological. But because of social conditions, it has to be treated in absolute sense in practice, right? So this is the understanding of like who's human and who is not. And black people are typically people on the right will talk about them as being culturally very, how should I put it, high time preference. Like, they only think of today or whatever. I think this is wrong. I think they're actually incredibly patient. And there's a quote from Robert Mugabe to this effect, where he says that when he was talked about, like, you're going to destroy the mines with all of these, like, you're destroying your capital markets or whatever. And he said, those minerals were under the ground before you came. They will be here thousands of years after you leave. If we want them, we will dig them up. And I mean, you might think that that's a flippant response, but in the context of all of the ways in which African political culture treats these big questions of like economics, these big economic questions, it makes sense. The reason they are worried about like immediate reward and then just making sure everybody is there and it's just the humans in charge, right? It's because once you've established that only the humans are there and in charge, then eventually everything will get better and sort itself out, right? It's having those divisions in society that's actually intolerable. And so you have to gradually squeeze out or integrate any difference, right? Create a homogenous polity that consists of one culture and hopefully one race. That is how they think about it, right? Now, not all black people ascribe to this ideology, but this is the characterization. This is the deep substance. There's also heavy emphasis on consensus building, which is why when you listen to Ramaphosa talk about any political issue, it's always, we must sit down and talk, we must sit down and talk, we must sit down and talk, we must sit down and talk. The point is to have the patience to sit down and reach a consensus. Now, in white society, we don't do this. In Western society, we don't do this. Instead, we say, well, look, we have this position, you have that position. We find either a compromise or we fight on it, right? We can live with our differences to some extent, and if we can't live with our differences, we'll just fight about it. It doesn't matter. We get on with it, right? You can sort of live with difference. You can't live with difference in African society. It's disruptive. It's a problem. And South Africa is not yet an African society. All of our institutions are Western. All of our ideas are filtered through Western philosophy. All of our mutual communication is in Western languages. It's, religion is Christian for the most part. There's a big sort of native religious substrate, but Christianity is enormous, right? So, yeah. So the National Democratic Revolution at the moment, the reason that Donald Trump attempting to reform South Africa won't work is two things, right? One, we're headed for a fiscal cliff. Now, the ANC is planning to go over this cliff. That is why they're lining up all of these little bills, right? The Expropriation Act, the much more important Land Courts Act, which will actually take the entire land reform process out of the hands of the executive and place it in an unaccountable judicial system. These judges will be immune from any form of criminal prosecution except for spousal battery. They will be allowed to pay informants. They will be allowed to disregard any evidence they like in the interest of expediency. They will be allowed to admit hearsay as evidence. Explicitly, hearsay is mentioned in the bill. It's not funny, right? And all of them will be selected directly by the president, not by the JSC. So, once the Land Courts Bill becomes implemented, it's absolutely bananas because anyone can apply on behalf of anyone else. It's complete shit show, right? Trump is Whether Trump is going to fix the situation or not, this is difficult to tell. Right? He certainly cannot reform our political system because no one can. There are no replacement elites for the African nationalists. The vast majority of black people vote for either the ANC or a party more radical than them. There's only a tiny, minuscule, and electorally insignificant sliver who vote for the Democratic Alliance, which is a left liberal party. They are social democrats. There are only 3 members of the party that I know of by name who are not complete lunatics. Okay, they are, however, highly effective and less corrupt than the ANC, but that's not saying much. So there's no replacement elite. There is no money to continue funding the way that we have been living, the enormous welfare expenditure, the enormous graft, and the support of the patronage system under the ANC that keeps the money flowing, even supporting the oligarchs with their sort of cartel arrangements in the economy that shut out small businesses. The current arrangement actually facilitates this, right? This is why you had Johan Rupert, one of the wealthiest members in the country, going over to Donald Trump to tell him, oh, I sleep with my doors open at night. Yes, in your massive palace with walls and armed guards that rivals the man lives with an amount of security that dwarfs anyone else's in the country, except for the president. And he's going to tell you that, he sleeps with the doors open. South Africa's fine. That man he is a devil. That's what he is. He really is a devil. I think the other problem is that fiscal cliff. So when I first noticed that OECD country chart rising, and I said, okay, well, you're heading for this sort of position where like now the state is taking up like half the economy. Where are you generating the money from? Right? You're going to squeeze your tax base to the point that you cannot get anything. Right? You cannot get any more out of it without just nationalizing everything and going full state, full status, doing the China or Soviet Russia thing. Right? You cannot get any more than that. Right? We're at the absolute hilt in the West in this regard. Right? And in South Africa, we are really we are beyond that. We are bleeding because we cannot maintain we cannot keep the debt servicing costs from rising, right? So I did a crude calculation where I sort of like, okay, when are we going to pass Bernhold's ratio and likely into sort of a default, right? So just using like crude sort of headline figures from the Treasury reports, I figure, okay, well, depending on whether we're like the first 5 years in the decade I analyzed or the second 5 years or the whole decade on average, we're either going to end up defaulting in 2028 or 2035. So somewhere between there. And then that was my sort of retard level back of the envelope calculation. And then soon after, Tavi Rutt and Andre Divenacher made their calculations, which said more or less the same thing using much more intelligent and subtle methods than I did. And so here we have a problem. And if you listen to these guys, you realize we're actually 95% debt to GDP. The headline figure that's reported is 75, but if you include state-owned enterprises and local municipal debt, it is 95% debt to GDP. We really are every year flipping a coin on whether we're going to crack. And so that quibble against over 1% VAT increase that you saw earlier this year, okay, yeah, it is kind of important. But it's not going to solve the problem. You need to strip 30% of government expenditure, or you need a permanent and irreversible freeze on all welfare payments and state salaries. That's not going to happen, right? So what can America gain from South Africa that would actually do anything, right? Well, South Africa is drifting closer to China. Here's what you do. You back Cape independence. You tell the DA to get their act together, right? Hold a referendum. Peel off the Cape. Cape has rare earth minerals. That's really nice for America. Okay. You safeguard the port, so you have someone who's making sure that the Cape Town has a functioning port to handle the enormous wave of traffic that's going around the Cape of Good Hope due to the interruptions in the Red Sea, which are ongoing and not likely to end anytime soon due to China's increased interference and support of the Houthi rebels through Iran. Yeah, you peel off the Western Cape, and it doesn't require much. Most of the Western Cape supports the idea. They're just so terrified of, black power that, well, they're not going to do it. Right? They're not going to. They're not going to vote for anyone who's not the DA. They're terrified. They're terrified. The DA's little Swart campaign does work. And then the other one is Zululand. Well, contact the Zulu king. Say, listen, if you develop your homeland areas, you can establish yourself as the prestige source of political and economic progress, as opposed to the Republican government that's opposing you and trying to liquidate your lands, right? In Ngonyama Trust. If you develop those lands and you make a good show of it, then you establish your prestige better. You get together with the IFP, you hold a little referendum, and you peel off. Well, of course, you got to wait for Jacob Zuma to die first, and then you pick up the pieces of the MK party, but you can do it. You make an independent Zululand. Yes, probably going to be quite bloody. Yes, but you can do it. I'm talking about this from a purely raw, realpolitik American perspective here. I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, although it might be. But you peel off the KZN. KZN controls Durban. Cape Town controls Cape Town. Western Cape controls Cape Town. Develop friendly relations with Mozambique and you get Maputo, right? Develop friendly relations with Namibia and you get Walvis Bay. You have now completely encircled the entire mineral industrial complex in South Africa. They can now no longer export in any serious quantity any of their minerals without playing ball. It is now checkmate, and South Africa has to work with the West, or at least become neutral and not interfere with free trade policy. And they're not allowed to discriminate against people either. The Western Cape can benefit from this. You institute immigration policy that says, well, if you are legally discriminated against in South Africa, you're welcome over here. That changes your demographic flow. You remove people who who are not long-term residents and who are breaking laws. So you get rid of organized criminals and you deport them back to South Africa. You get rid of squatters, you deport them back to South Africa. And you can reverse the demographic flow. You have a nice stable population in the Western Cape. You have a stable population in South Africa. You have a stable population in Zululand. And now you've got a system that can actually function long term. The only other thing that needs to be fixed is to break up the two main municipalities in Gauteng, so that Soweto and Johannesburg are separate and Tshwane and Pretoria are separate. Once you've achieved that, you've got such a stable arrangement in the heart of the economy that South Africa can only grow, right? Because you will have stable municipalities up there. You'll have metropolitan governments that don't break apart every year. No? So you partition South Africa in two places and you partition the municipalities in two places, right? And this double partition will get you a South Africa or a former South Africa that will grow radically fast. And everyone can benefit. And there's no need to do any kind of crazy shit. But you cannot make South Africa better because there are fundamental structural problems. Right? You cannot destroy local patronage and hope to remain in power. Do you understand? That is why Zimbabwe had to do the insane things that they had to do. It was for political survival. That's what ZANU-PF was doing it for. Yes, ideology played a massive role. Let's not deny it, right? But if you want to maintain in power and keep your buddies from shooting you in the back of the head, these are the things that you do to your country. And the ANC is approaching that direction, and so is the DA. And the DA are getting sucked along with them. They are now defending expropriation in public, right? So I'm going to take a couple of questions, and then I have to go pick up my kids. So I'm going to scroll through and see if anyone's asked anything. But my final remark here, the conclusion that should have been right at the head, actually, is this. Where? Wow, how did that pop out of my head all of a sudden? No. No, we are not. We are not going to have a genocide in this country. But what we very well may suffer is a protracted sort of extinguishing, because we're not going to survive after the collapse of this country, and there is no way to stop the collapse. So, I mean, here's the one thing. If you want to deal with the debt problem, the Western Cape can take its share of the debt, or even more, and pay it off. It would be able to, because it would be an extraordinarily fast-growing economy. Almost every analyst who's ever looked at the question says 7% growth a year. Yeah. How would you be able to partition Pretoria through legal means? First question. Well, there's something called the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, which means that if a section of the administrative state has handed down some policy, it has to hand them down equally and for the same reasons everywhere. Right? So, a few years ago, they had a problem with the Malamulele district in Limpopo and what is now the Collins Chabane district. This is a Tsonga group. They were complaining that they were being shut out of local government by the vendors. So you had, now the ANC takes tribal disputes very seriously because ethnic differences can cause problems, you know. They remember the People's War against the Zulu nationalists. So they intervene, and the municipal district, what was it called? The Municipal Demarcation Board, right? They usually they deny like 98, 99% of all applications to have boundaries changed. But now it drew the attention of the president who got involved, Jacob Zuma got involved, it was the whole 9 yards. And they partitioned this municipality so that the Tsonga could have their own municipality and the Venda could have their own municipality. Right? So they have partitioned municipalities on the basis of ethnicity and ethnic exclusion before. The Promotion of Administrative Justice Act means that, well, if you have a similar case, you can do it. So you can do this in Pretoria. You can definitely do this in Pretoria. I would try and actually argue this with Soweto, actually, first, because it's a little bit easier once you get that done. And I mean, look, Soweto would fare much better. You wouldn't have to deal with the ANC supporters in Johannesburg. You wouldn't have to deal with the DA supporters in Johannesburg, right? You'd get a government that was composed of, well, the kind of sort of black consciousness mentality people that community is based in. You know, you'd have a different municipal structure. I think, you know, if you're worried about balancing the fiscus, you can just donate money from one municipality to the other to keep it stable until it develops. But it's much better if you split the administration so that you can actually have, because people vote by race in this country. We vote by race. This is not going to change. It is not changing. It never has changed. I'll fucking show you something right now, right? No, not that one. I will show you something right now. Right? Let's go here. This. Yo, Larry Dung. Let me just pop this over here. So I've plotted over here the electoral results since 1994. Why is this thing so annoying? I can't. The zoom wheel on my mouse is broken, so I get this kind of problem at the moment if I don't. Come on. There we go. Okay, this is as good as I'm going to get. So I'm having to zoom with the trackpad on this laptop, which is rubbish. But, okay. But you can see over here, right? This is the national election results, and you've got, you know, your ANC. I had to plot the ANC on the other, on this axis over here. Otherwise, it just dwarfs all of this, and you can't see the difference between the parties, right? And then I clustered those parties into groups. So the green line over here is the ANC and its splinter parties. This line over here is the NP and the DA and the Vryheidsfront plus together. And then the red line is the IFP and the black line is others, right? And this is what it is, right? I mean, look, people are voting less and less, and I've got that graph here. This is actually my big document for electoral data. So I've got that over here. I haven't updated the electoral turnout for the latest election, but I got it up to 2021. So but I calculated as well the voting age population and the ratio over there. So the solid lines over here are absolute numbers of people, and then the dotted lines are ratios, and there's two ratios here. So the blue line is how many people showed up at the ballot box, right? So it's bumbling around like 10 million, like 10 or 15 million around here. And then you've got registered voters start out there in 94 at 22 million and end up at 26 million. It's not much of a growth. Voting age population gone from 22 million up to what's it over here is 40 million. But the amount of people voting remain the same, more or less. And so your turnout as a percent of voting age population is now down here. That's the red dotted line. That's 30%, right? Less than 30%. So less than 30% of the people are voting. And of that 30%, you've got, that's what you're dividing up between the parties. Right? The voting less basically offsets the white percentage decrease. Patrick Vianiello said this, right? And he's absolutely right. It does absolutely directly offset the decline of minority populations. And this is, and the Western Cape is doing excellently because people hate the black nationalist parties so much that that you get this. Okay, there's KZN. Okay, you can see there's a resurgence in Zulu parties a little bit. Blah blah blah. Western Cape looks like this. So if you cluster the election results like this, you've got ANC, NP, DA, let's say the white and conservative coloured, right, goes like this. That's them. They sit up here. Okay, and there's the NP dying on its arse over here in orange, and there's the DA taking over and swapping out their voters. But that red line over there, that's ANC and EFF together. They're not like 20-something%. There's no point in them. And then over here, there's this purple line where I added to get, beg your pardon, and it's green over here. But I added them together, and they're the colored nationalist groups, right? Colored identity groups. That's an important figure right there. So, but they seem to sort of stagnate at around 10%, because what you can see over here is actually you've got the Patricia de Lille's Independent Democrats at their peak at about 10%. And if you add together, PA and the Good Party and the Cape Colored Congress and everything, they don't really break out of that zone. So you've got this colored voting bloc that really likes being, is really big on colored interest, but they're small because they're split and they don't trust each other. It's very complicated. But anyway, that's a whole other kettle of fish. But yeah, so we're not getting out of this because no one's going to change how they're voting, right? The DA are trying again to do the whole business like they did in Musa Maimana's day of like going, it's like being friendly to black nationalists. In the old days, they went woke, and now they're doing actually land reform and racial discrimination are fine. Don't worry about it. And I think they're being patriotic doing so. I think it's disgusting, actually. The betrayal of the highest order, they should be liquidated. Whole party should be tossed. Bloody hate them. With the exception of 3 very decent people, but yeah. Right. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to mention to you guys. I mean, America might do targeted sanctions on the ANC, but that's going to hurt a lot of people because the business network is very tied up with them. It's going to make things awkward. Black economic empowerment is deeply entrenched. It's not you're not going to unwind that anytime soon. So let's do a couple of questions, and then I'm going to bolt. Who would have thanked amazing talk and insight? Blah 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 blah. Remarks. Let's see any questions. Lots of remarks. So, here we go. TP saying that they aren't just rushing the National Democratic Revolution; they still haven't gotten to stage 3. What? suppose it's a fair assessment, but I mean, it is remarkable how they started like clockwork on 25 years, and they prepared for this in 2012. Remember when I said that the balance of forces shifted in 2012, right? Around that time, in 2012, 2013. It's funny because Nelson Mandela dies in 2013, and then Julius Malema is kicked out of the party and starts the EFF, and at the same time, the ANC draws up the framework for the second phase of the National Democratic Revolution. It's like a very interesting, very pivotal period, right? Those 2 or 3 years. Right? You also have Marikana in 2012. So it's like this whole, like that's a really, really pivotal period in our modern history that no one's really been looking at. And it's not because all of these things are interconnected. It's just they, some of them have common causes, and some of them, I think that sort of shift of power really sort of is felt. But anyways, he also TP also says, I think the high time preference is more how they act in majority white countries where they're being able to do so. You know, I'm actually kind of, I don't know about that. I'll have to give that a hard think. I think you're probably right. I think sort of, you know, Africans, when they become stripped of their cultural roots, sort of, they don't have that sort of deep time to refer to anymore. I think that sort of short-termist perspective that a lot of them appear to have is a lot of it's a consequence of poverty, or experience of poverty. I think we misread them at our peril. I think that Black political culture actually does refer to deep time a lot. I think that's actually an important thing to bear in mind. You got Kwanzaa M. I have a question as an American. Do you think Trump is helping or hurting Afrikaners? Yeah, I mean, you say you get conflicting answers here. I agree. I mean, I think the results are conflicting. He could make it worse because, as I said earlier on, is that the reaction has been, it has consolidated the elite response in South Africa. You got all of your major institutions have just like closed ranks. I mean, people who are attacking the DA before, or the ANC before this, have now just gone, no, sorry, actually, all American criticisms are wrong. We're doing just fine. We'll take care of it ourselves. Don't worry. We don't need your help. You know, and like all of the things that they were attacking, like, you know, expropriation or racial discrimination, whatever they said, you know, like, oh no, actually, it's all under control. Don't worry about it. It's totally fine. And it's like, I mean, do you actually want to solve these problems or not? Because I mean, if you go to the American presidency and say, listen, we need your help doing A, B, C, and D. These are the things that we want to get done. You know, it's scary because someone who has actual power that can do actual changes. Change is really scary because you don't know what's going to actually happen. I am not someone who's scared of change in this way because I actually think that there is no risk-free position anymore. People who are worried about risk in South Africa and politically, there is no risk-free position. Tactically and strategically, there are risky positions. And so I would not advocate people doing anything too crazy yet, right? That moment is not too far off, but you don't want to do crazy things, should we say. Don't do anything crazy, don't do anything illegal, at least not until it becomes obvious that that's where we are. And we're not quite there yet, okay? So, I think, yeah, because I mean, that's a question of balance of forces. Like the state is actually still pretty strong. I mean, it looks very weak, and it is weak in many different ways comparatively to the West. But as an organization that can come and mess you up, they still are very much a force to be reckoned with. And I don't think anyone is really equipped to take on the state in South Africa, and so therefore should not do anything illegal ever. Just don't do it. You know, not for the sake of any political action. That's just, it's a bad risk. Okay. But in terms of solutions you're looking for, seriously, there are no risk-free positions to take, right? Everything is risking. You're putting your money on the roulette table, either black or red. You're putting it somewhere, you know, whatever political end you're hoping for. I don't think Donald Trump was is not a good lawyer, blah, blah, blah. So this American fellow called Kwanzaa, I don't think Trump really cares much about South Africa. Yeah, maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I can't read the guy. And from my perspective, it's like, I can't sit and psychologize about what Trump really thinks. I've just got to go, what does it look like he's trying to do? What are the things he's preparing for? How do they affect me? If I could speak to a member of his cabinet, what would I say? And I would say, partition the country, put pressure on them to partition the country, because you need this country to survive. You really do. If we go belly up, it's not just going to be us that goes down. It's every neighboring country is going to go down, because they rely on us for trade, not just like we buy their goods or whatever, because we're the biggest consumer market. It's also that we're a trade gateway, and like they're desperately scrambling to assemble alternative sort of logistical routes through Botswana, Namibia, and so on. But I mean, if we go down, the impact on government revenue, you're going to take like somewhere between a 10 and 50% chunk, depending on which country you talk about, out of the national revenue of countries going up to the Congo. So this is going to result in like fiscal crises stretching through countries that are still war-torn and have like separatist movements and things like this, right? So if South Africa goes down, you're not just talking about the survival of people down here, we're talking about the survival of millions of people going all the way up into the heart of Africa. At least 100% Zulu Boy was funny. Yeah, it's odd, isn't that? I mean, like, I used to resent that comparison that Trevor Noah made between Zuma and Donald Trump, because I thought it was bloody stupid. But there are a lot of interesting actual parallels between their personalities and personal styles. They're both sort of comedians, although, but yeah, they also have other foibles, but let's not get too deep into that. Even if Western Cape gets independence now, it's too late. There's a lot of not yet registered migrants in the Western Cape. Well, that's not a problem. If they're not registered, like they're not registered, they're not even legal South African citizenship. You can do things that are both sort of like reasonable and humane and non-racialist, and also still geared towards balancing out your sort of stable population. So, for example, and this is the reasonable perspective, right? As far as I'm concerned, a very stable one is you just say, look, if you're an illegal immigrant to South Africa, right, we are going to help deport you, right? Because Western Cape, blah, 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 we're also victims of illegal immigration. If you come from South Africa and you've been here for your entire life, or your parents are born here, so on, full citizenship immediately, right? Ancestral citizenship too. You get ancestral citizenship. But anyone who arrived in the Western Cape after, hell, I don't know, if you want to be really strict, you could say 1985, since the end of the Group Areas Act's sort of enforcement. If you want to be radical but not that radical, you could say 1994. If you wanted to be pragmatic, you'd say 2010, 2011, because that's when you get the real major influx, right? And then what you do is you just make people pick their citizenship, and either you get on the train to becoming a Cape citizen, or you leave. It's or you keep your South African citizenship. But if you are not yet a Cape citizen and you commit any crime, you're immediately deported to whichever country you qualify for citizenship in, and that's probably going to be South Africa. And you can get a huge number of troublesome individuals. Right? You can clear when you do a slum clearance. You say, "Well, do you have a title deed for this?" No, I'm sorry. Okay, bye. And this really does give you a lot of options here, because then it allows you to take all those massive land invasions that have happened over the past decade and a half, and you get to reverse them. And it's, you don't have to discriminate by race. You just say, if you've invaded our land, you have to go. I'm sorry. And what you have after this is you should return to about a 20, 50, 30 balance between white, colored, and black. And that's a good ratio. It means that colored people remain the decisive majority. Okay, they can feel at home in their own communities, right? Their land is theirs, so to speak, right? But white people will remain an outperforming minority that is wealthier than the rest. So we can't be pushed around, right? We don't have to be supreme. We don't have to dominate everything, and we probably won't, because organizations with whites and coloreds in sort of actually function relatively smoothly, right? We've been together for 400 years. We get each other's vibe, But the black population, well, if the coloreds decide to get way too radical and way too jingoistic, well, then blacks and whites get to keep them in check a little bit. If whites get too uppity, well, we're only 20%. We're not going to get our way. And if black people decide to cause trouble, well, then they're 30%, and they have to behave themselves too. And I think this, relative to how they perform and how much sort of attention and moral sort of valence they have in society, it's actually quite a tidy proportion. And this would only be turning the clock back 10 to 15 years anyhow. Yeah, and you attract all of the people who you have to partially achieve this by attracting all the minorities in the rest of the country who are discriminated against. But I think over time it'll balance out quite nicely. How would I secure areas from farm attacks? I would defer to the specialists, right? I mean, these people have been doing it for a long time. Check out Jacques Broederijk. That guy from AfriForum Security. He tells they've got everything on public, what they do, how their tactics work, how their training works, how they communicate. It's really hard work, and it's community based, and it's that's what they do. They just got to keep going, But there's a whole thing for saving the interior after partition, which involves starting work now. But Solidarity, I am sorry to say, has been dragging their feet. I did a huge work on them, trying to give them a sketch of like little pilot projects they can do for securing localized territorial control legally in the present, right? But they have to actually start moving now, and they need to start moving very decisively, and they're not doing that because they sort of think that everything is going to follow like a linear, gradual process, and the state's going to wither away. It's not how it works. It's at a certain point, the snow melts slowly. Yeah, look how slowly it's melting. It's going to melt. No, at a certain point it slips, and then you have an avalanche and you have a problem. So, and that doesn't mean a genocide. That just means things will become unmanageable if you have not built a shelter. So Afrikaners in the interior need to work, and that's something America can't help them with. They have to do it themselves. Now, how would you put Partition Pretoria through legal means? I'll answer that quickly. And then, what has the reaction in the country been to Trump's interventions? Fucking bananas, dude. Like, as I said, you had this establishment consolidate around the thing. But if you look on Twitter, you see a lot of people who are cheering on Donald Trump. And I think, no. Calm down. Calm down. This could still end up screwing this all up for us, because he's taken the position of saying this is a genocide. It's not. This is unreasonable. Right? I appreciate the attention. It's burst the bubble. It's meant that we are now in the public eye again. No one can avoid addressing us, right? But if we decide to say to use extravagant language like that, then we are going to lose credibility over time. So we need to actually focus on these things and put it and have perspective and have a bit of a grounded view of these things and say, yes, we are in deep threat, but we can save ourselves. We would just like you to make sure that people don't feel a sense of impunity in doing whatever they like to us, and we will do most of what is required, the vast majority of what is required to get ourselves on a firm standing. Look, white South Africans, we don't want to hurt anyone else. We just want to make sure we are secure. Our future is secure. Okay, and this was me too. I don't want to hurt anyone else. I don't want to get I don't want an acquisitive position, right? I want to just make sure we're fine. We can live a normal life. We have a future for our kids. Nothing. This is nothing sort of aggrandizement. I don't want to dominate other people. I don't enjoy it. I like having a normal sort of vibe where I can get on with my day, and not have to worry about that. I'd want to one day live in a country that feels like it's normal, just living life, right? There's a sense of normality. This tension can go away. We're worrying about whether or not things are going to happen, whether or not the country's going to be here in 5 or 10 years is not a question, right? That's why I support things like Cape Independence and so on, because it's like you have to hope for something like that, or what have you got to hope for? I mean, dissolving your identity by going overseas, that doesn't solve anything. The West's got its own problems at large, It's in decline in a very generalizing way. And at a certain point, there's going to be a crisis of a very nasty proportion, and you don't know what it's going to look like. UK is talking about bringing back the draft to send people to Ukraine. This is not a world I'm interested in taking part in. I like being in South Africa, where we're not really actually a part of the West's bloody spiritual struggles. All we need is a kind word occasionally, Just sort of say, well, hey, so people asking, okay, what do you think are the consequences to state security of allowing Starlink to operate in South Africa? Well, it means that, America will have a global surveillance program that has a permanent security contract with the state, and they can spy on anyone, anywhere, anytime. That's that's no good. So if you have government facilities, what you're going to have to do from now on is actually have a seriously gated intranet that has no contact with the outside world. You're going to have that everywhere. In order to have any kind of security, you need to be very serious about it. Surveillance is serious business now. When is Western Cape seceding? Well, it might not. We might not actually get what we want. We might actually flub it, and there's a good chance we will, because we are not very organized and we're not very well funded. And the establishment has taken up all of the white vote into the Democratic Alliance, who hates the idea of Cape secession and really supports the ANC right now. Right? So we have been very, very vigorously betrayed, and people are not waking up to it yet. Right? They've not realized this because they're just not reading. They're just not reading. And the people who it's frustrating. Okay. So TPR, so I was imagining a scenario of the breakdown had gotten beyond elections being held. That's actually that's a phenomenon that's hard to contemplate right now. I've used that graph in so many Boomer family members. Yeah, talking about the election demographics. Oh, yeah. Spun spec SquarePants. I don't know why that's funny. How do you think the DA will come out of this whole thing? They're going to look awful. I think they're going to gain. I think they're actually going to gain a sliver of the sort of middle-aged, middle-class black voters. A little sliver of that. And that tiny gain is going to go to their heads, as it's already gone to their heads. They've been getting that back in their internal polling, right? It's going to go to their heads, and they're going to stick to becoming like the ANC, but like slicker and more professional, right? And less sort of revolutionary. That's sort of their thing. And they might very well become the largest party in South Africa, because the ANC is just going to shrink. I don't think the DA is going to grow significantly. But when that happens, Ramaphosa is not going to be in the driving seat, and I think you're going to see an ANC reunion coalition. I don't think they're going to want to, but I think they're going to do it out of a sense of survival. They're going to say, like, I'm sorry. They're going to go like, yeah, no, we can't let the DA overturn everything, right? There is a small chance, but not insignificant, that the DA actually keeps control of a coalition in the national government and takes that sort of prime pole position. But it'll be hamstrung and won't be able to get much done. And they will reveal, once they are number one and they're in charge and they've got the presidency, that they're actually not changing anything. And then I think after the first year, there's going to be a sense of panic that will set in amongst minorities that will be palpable. Temporary measures. The DA is a white first world party. Oh yeah, a Western first world party. Yeah, sorry, I thought you meant like a white first party, which wouldn't entirely be accurate. One of the consequences of allowing Starlink to operate now. So yeah, we read that one. Pink-a-dink-a-ding. What's the response in the country to Trump's intervention? Have I read that already? Am I getting the same thing twice? Yeah. calling it genocide is a straw man tactic from the left to dismiss actual calls for genocide. Yeah, because I mean, once you get the genocide going, it's like only once like half of us die, then we can complain. We've got to wait until we got 50% casualty rate before we can say, "Hi guys, we're having a bit of a problem. Would you mind?" Like, oh, it's the same thing as like Rwanda. I mean, like they knew the genocide was coming, and they just waited until it was happening, and they said, "Oh dear, isn't that awful?" And what did Condoleezza Rice say about? Well, people are just like that down there, in that part of the world. Condoleezza Rice. Can you imagine if George Bush, his presidency would be over? Yeah. Refugee program for minorities. I think it's bad for us. It's good for the people who take it. That's the problem. It's like, it's terrible. It's terrible for South Africa. For everyone in South Africa, it's terrible that people are taking up the refugee program. It's great for the people who leave. It's terrible for the rest of us. And like, this is a hard thing because I always maintain that, you know, if you got people to support, family to support, whatever, you can't not grasp at something that's going to help you, you know? But at the same time, I sort of think, you know, the other side of me thinks, well, yeah, but if it ever gets significant in flow, in volume, it's going to cripple our capacity to ever defend ourselves, and everything's going to get terminally worse, and most of us will never get out. We'll be left like those old Boer who were stuck in Angola, you know. Oh, my goodness. I'm in Australia and have already started learning Mandarin because the government doesn't seem to have a plan to avoid vassalage. That's from TP, this character. So now you've brought. I'm going to end on this one. I'm going to bugger off. You've said something that's very, very interesting. So, like, China's encircling Australia, right? China's encircling Australia. When push comes to shove, Australia is going to need to be able to trade on its own terms. But all of your trade routes depart up through Indonesia and then through Straits of Malacca or through the Suez Canal. And that's how you trade with Europe, right? And you're even being blocked in some of the better trade routes across the Pacific, right? Not yet, but China's demonstrating their capacity to do so through a lot of sort of harassment campaigns and through naval drills, right? If you really want to sort of make sure that you can still trade with Europe after China pulls a fast one on you, you need Cape to go independent because you need to secure that route through the southern seas. Because actually, you can't just race through the Antarctic. Those waves break ships in half, right? So there's like this little narrow band that goes through the Agulhas bank where you can sail relatively safely. But even still, it's one of the deadliest passages in the world, right? If you take any place where more than 10,000 sort of ships pass a year, it comes top, right? So the Cape is the only way to save Australia. The Cape is the only way to save the Atlantic as a Western sphere of influence, right? So, hell's bells, guys, get your act together. Come stick some money in our coffers. Help us campaign for Cape independence. It'd be fun, CIAG is taking, right? CIP is taking. And they all got their hands out for donations. At the moment, it's people who are like struggling to everyone's. Everyone's asking like, okay, who's paying for petrol? Who's going to catch a lift with who? It's like that kind of crap, It's like this is the scenario that people are dealing with organizing a movement like Cape Independence. Like nobody wants to stick money into it. Political parties happen because there's money, right? I mean, you need more than money. You need the movement to be genuine, but it needs money, right? We're not getting money because the oligarchy has decided no. The only people who play the game are the people who status quo. You are for status quo, say what you like, do what you like. You can participate. If you're against the status quo, bugger off. Right? But here's the thing. Genocide is not happening, but, not everything that isn't genocide is hunky-dory. And, Black South Africans are not doing themselves any favors. You can't save everyone, but you can mitigate the damage. And I think I'm just 100% for partition. That's me. But I can't. I'm not a gifted political organizer. I'm not even gifted at organizing my own life. I'm okay. I get by. I manage to make ends meet. Sometimes I'm very close to not. But I can see certain things. I do research these topics as much as I can, and I hope that I can get people to talk sense for once, at least a little sliver of people. But yeah, no, I thanks for dropping in, everybody. I'll try and do something more structured next time, and then I think once the website gets back online, I'll be posting news articles fairly regularly, opinion articles fairly regularly, and we're going to do. I have someone else who's going to help me on the paper soon, and then we can do news roundups and interviews and all of the usual sort of stuff that you see, little news outlets doing. So that's coming down the pipeline. I just thought I'd do a little ad hoc thing on this to try and understand some of the background issues. But yeah, I've got to go run. I'm actually a little bit late picking up my kids, but cheers.